Welcome back to Sleepless History, the podcast where we take the grandest, bloodiest, most consequential moments in human civilization and lay them out slowly, carefully, and in just enough detail that you can either learn something remarkable or drift off into a very historically informed sleep. Either outcome is perfectly acceptable here. We do not judge. Tonight's episode is a long one, a good one. So get comfortable and let us take a quiet journey back to the frozen edge of medieval Europe, to a world of iron and faith, of exile and return, of armies marching across ice so thick it could hold thousands of men, and then, at precisely the right moment, it could not. This is the story of the Battle of the Ice, fought on April 5th, 1242, on the surface of a frozen lake on the border of what is now Russia and Estonia. It is the story of a prince named Alexander, later called Nevsky, who may have been one of the greatest military tacticians of the medieval world, or who may have simply been a man in the right place at the right time, depending on which historian you prefer. It is the story of the Teutonic Knights, some of the most formidably armoured and ideologically motivated warriors the medieval world ever produced. And it is, ultimately, the story of a piece of ice that cracked at exactly the right moment, and what that crack came to mean for centuries of people who needed to believe in something. We will be here for a while, so settle in. If you've tuned in tonight to help your mind drift off, you're in the right place. That's the reason I create these. If you find this helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about where you're listening from and what the time is. I love reading through the comments. There's something surreal about knowing someone is watching at midnight in San Francisco while someone else is starting their day in Stockholm or grabbing a quick lunch in Sydney. Chapter 1. The Northern Crusades. God, Ice, and the drive to the east. Let us begin not with the battle, but with the world that made the battle possible, because the Battle of the Ice did not emerge from nowhere. It was not a random skirmish between two groups of men who happened to wander into each other on a frozen lake. It was the product of decades, and in some sense centuries, of religious tension, political ambition, and a very particular European ideology that historians have come to call, in German, the Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east. To understand that drive, we have to go back to the very concept of the Crusades themselves, and specifically to a version of the Crusades that most people in the popular imagination have completely forgotten about. When most people think of the Crusades, they think of the Holy Land. They think of Jerusalem, of sun-scorched deserts, of Richard the Lionheart, of Saladin, of the Church, of the Holy Sepulchre. And those Crusades are important, certainly. But the Crusades were not only a Middle Eastern phenomenon, they were also, and perhaps just as significantly, a Northern European phenomenon. And the Northern Crusades unfolded across a very different landscape, not desert and dust and ancient stone, but forests and rivers and, in winter, ice stretching as far as any eye could see. The Northern Crusades began in earnest in the 12th century, though their roots go back further than that. The papacy, having established the ideological and theological machinery of holy war, found that the idea could be exported. If it was righteous to fight for the liberation of Jerusalem from Muslim rule, then surely it was equally righteous to convert, by force if necessary, the pagan peoples of the Baltic and Eastern European Rim. The Lithuanians were pagan, the Prussians were pagan, the Livonians, the Estonians, the Latvians, all pagan. And paganism, in the theology of the medieval Roman Catholic Church, was not simply a neutral alternative lifestyle, It was an offence against God, a wound in the body of Christendom, and it demanded correction. Now, there is something important to understand about how medieval people thought about religious conversion. We, in the modern world, tend to think of religious belief as a deeply personal, interior thing, something that happens in the private landscape of individual conscience. In the medieval world, and particularly in the medieval Catholic understanding, religion was fundamentally communal and political. A ruler who converted became a Christian ruler. His people, therefore, became Christian people. Baptism was less about individual spiritual transformation and more about entry into a political and civilizational community. And so the conversion of pagan rulers and their subjects was not merely a spiritual project, it was a geopolitical one. And here is where the Teutonic Knights enter the story. But before we meet them, let us linger just a moment longer on the broader phenomenon of the Northern Crusades, because it is genuinely underappreciated in popular history, and it sets the entire stage for everything that follows. The Northern Crusades were not one thing. They were a series of overlapping campaigns conducted over more than 2 centuries, involving different armies, different organisers, different targets, and different degrees of papal involvement. There were crusades against the Wends, the Slavic peoples of what is now northeastern Germany, in the 12th century. There were crusades against the Lithuanians that continued well into the 14th century. There were campaigns against the Finns, against the Estonians, against the Latvians. The whole northern and northeastern rim of Europe was, for several generations, a zone of crusading activity. And the logic of these campaigns was always roughly the same. Pagan populations needed to be converted by persuasion, if possible, and by force, if not, and the lands they occupied were available for Christian settlement and governance. The ideology behind this was not simply greed dressed up in religious language, though greed was certainly present, as it is present in most human enterprises, including holy ones. The genuine theological conviction was real. Medieval people, including the knights themselves, including the prelates who authorized the campaigns, including the Pope who blessed them, genuinely believed that they were doing God's work. That is not a comfortable thing to reckon with, because the things done in God's name in the Northern Crusades were genuinely terrible. Entire peoples were subjected to coercive conversion. Those who resisted were killed. Those who nominally converted and then lapsed were treated as apostates deserving of the harshest punishment. The Prussian people, as previously noted, were effectively eliminated as a distinct cultural entity, and all of this was authorized, celebrated, and encouraged by the institutional structures of the Latin Christian Church. Understanding that the perpetrators were acting from genuine religious conviction rather than cynical calculation does not make the results any more acceptable. It perhaps makes them more disturbing, because it reminds us that sincere belief in a cause is no guarantee against terrible outcomes. The Teutonic Knights, full name, the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, were a military religious order founded in the late 12th century during the Third Crusade. Like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller before them, they combined the ideals of monasticism with those of knighthood. A Teutonic Knight was theoretically a monk. He had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. He prayed, he fasted, he attended divine offices, and then, when called upon, he put on a very substantial amount of iron and went to fight in the name of Christ. Initially, the Teutonic Knights operated in the Holy Land, like their more famous counterparts. But in the early 13th century, they found a new mission much closer to home. In 1226, a Polish duke named Conrad of Masovia, frustrated by the relentless raids of the pagan Prussian tribes on his territories, made an extraordinary offer to the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, a man named Hermann von Salza. Conrad offered the knights a region called the Chelmno Land as a base of operations in exchange for their help conquering and Christianizing Prussia. The Pope ratified this arrangement, and so began one of the most consequential and eventually one of the most brutal military campaigns in medieval European history. Over the following decades, the Teutonic Knights methodically conquered, colonized, and converted the peoples of what is now northern Poland, the Baltic coast, and eventually Lithuania and Latvia. The process was not gentle. Indigenous populations who resisted were killed. Those who submitted were baptized and incorporated into a new German-speaking Christian order of society. Towns were built. Castles were erected. German settlers were invited in. The native Prussian language, entirely unrelated to what we now call German, actually a Baltic language, was gradually extinguished. By the end of the medieval period, the original Prussians had essentially ceased to exist as a distinct people. This campaign of conquest and colonization, this Drang nach Osten, was not merely the project of the Teutonic Knights alone. It was part of a broader eastward migration of German-speaking peoples, culture, and political institutions that reshaped the entire demographic and cultural landscape of Central and Eastern Europe, and its effects echoed for centuries, arguably all the way up to the 20th century, when Hitler invoked the idea of Lebensraum, or living space, as a justification for the conquest of Eastern Europe. The ideology had very old roots. But let us stay in the 13th century for now, because the 13th century is already complicated enough. By the 1230s and 1240s, the Teutonic Knights had expanded their operations northward into Livonia, roughly the territory of what is now Estonia and Latvia, absorbing another crusading order, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, who had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Lithuanians in 1236. The merged organisation became known as the Livonian Order, technically a branch of the Teutonic Knights, though operating with considerable autonomy in the far north. It was this Livonian branch that would eventually clash with Alexander Nevsky on the ice of Lake Peipus. And here we come to the second great tension that made the Battle of the Ice possible, the friction between Roman Catholicism and Russian Orthodoxy. This is a friction that is almost impossible to overstate in its historical significance, and almost equally impossible to explain quickly. So let us take our time with it. Christianity had, by the 13th century, already divided into two great branches. The Western branch, centered on Rome, led by the Pope, conducting its liturgy primarily in Latin, was what we call the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern branch, centered on Constantinople, led by the Patriarch, conducting its liturgy in Greek and in the languages of the various Slavic and other peoples who had converted, was what we call Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The formal split between these two branches, known as the Great Schism, had occurred in 1054, when the Pope and the Patriarch had excommunicated each other in a dispute over theological and political authority that had been building for centuries. By the time of the Battle of the Ice, this schism was nearly 200 years old, and it had calcified into something very deep, not just a theological disagreement about the nature of the Holy Spirit or the authority of the Pope, but a civilizational divide. The Catholic West and the Orthodox East had developed different artistic traditions, different liturgical practices, different political philosophies, different relationships between church and state. They looked at each other, frankly, with a great deal of suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. The people of Novgorod, the great Russian trading republic that Alexander Nevsky was associated with, were Orthodox Christians, and the Teutonic and Livonian Knights who came against them were Catholic Christians. To the Knights, converting the Russians to Catholicism was not categorically different from converting the pagans of the Baltic. A different kind of Christianity was still, in a sense, the wrong kind of Christianity. Rome had ultimate authority over all of Christendom, or so Rome believed, and peoples who acknowledged a different ecclesiastical authority were, in a meaningful theological sense, in error. The Russians, of course, saw things very differently. From the Orthodox perspective, Rome was the schismatic. Rome was the innovator. Rome had departed from the ancient traditions of the undivided church. And so the Teutonic and Livonian Knights were not liberators bringing correct Christianity to the benighted East. They were aggressive heretics intent on destroying the true faith. To appreciate how sharp this division was, it helps to think about what the Great Schism actually meant in practice, beyond the theological details. The two churches had developed not just different doctrines, but genuinely different aesthetic and devotional cultures. The Orthodox liturgy, conducted in Greek and Church Slavonic, was a thing of profound sensory richness, incense, elaborate vestments, chanted prayers, the shimmering gold of icon screens separating the nave from the altar. Orthodox theology was deeply shaped by Greek philosophical categories, particularly the tradition of apophatic theology, approaching God through negation, through what God is not, and by the writings of the Church Fathers of the Eastern Mediterranean. The interior of an Orthodox church was designed to evoke the heavenly realm. The worshipper entering was meant to feel transported into a different order of reality. The Western Catholic tradition was equally rich, but differently oriented. Gothic architecture, reaching upward with pointed arches and flying buttresses, flooding the interior with coloured light, expressed a different theological sensibility. The scholastic tradition of Western philosophy, building on Aristotle as interpreted by theologians like Thomas Aquinas, applied rational argumentation to theological questions in ways that the Eastern tradition often viewed with suspicion. The papal centralization of authority, the Bishop of Rome as supreme head of the universal church, was something the Orthodox world simply did not accept and had not accepted for centuries. When Catholic Crusaders had sacked Constantinople itself in 1204, the Fourth Crusade, one of the most catastrophic events in Byzantine history, in which an army that had set out for the Holy Land instead turned on the greatest Christian city in the world, the wound between the two churches had deepened into something close to permanent. The Orthodox world had not forgotten. The Catholics had sacked their holy city, had placed a Catholic emperor on the Byzantine throne, had looted the Hagia Sophia. The bitterness this generated was, by 1242, nearly 40 years old and still very much alive. This religious dimension matters enormously for understanding what the Battle of the Ice meant, and why it has been remembered the way it has been remembered. This was not just a territorial dispute. This was not just two groups of medieval men fighting over who got to collect taxes from certain peasants. This was, or was experienced as, a clash between two entire civilizations and two entire versions of Christianity. And that kind of conflict tends to produce very durable myths. Now, the political geography of northwestern Russia in the early 13th century was also deeply complicated, and we need to at least sketch it out before we can understand Alexander Nevsky's situation. Novgorod, properly called Lord Veliky Novgorod, or Novgorod the Great, was one of the most important cities in medieval Russia. It sat at the northern end of a great river system connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, making it a hub of trade between Scandinavia and the Byzantine world. The famous Varangian route, along which the Norse traders and warriors who settled among the Slavic peoples had travelled for centuries, ran through Novgorod. The city was wealthy, it was cosmopolitan, it traded with the Hanseatic League and with Byzantium and with the various principalities to its south and east, and it had a very particular political culture. Novgorod was not, technically, a monarchy in the conventional medieval sense. It was something closer to a republic, or at least an oligarchic republic. Power in Novgorod rested primarily with a council of wealthy merchants and boyars, the Russian term for the aristocratic class. The city had a prince, but the prince's role was almost that of a hired executive. He commanded the military, he administered justice, but he served at the pleasure of the Novgorodian assembly called the Vetch, and he could be, and frequently was, expelled when the assembly felt he had overstepped his bounds or simply become inconvenient. This political structure is crucial to understanding Alexander's story because it explains both his exile from Novgorod and his recall. But that is a story for the next chapter. The broader Russian political landscape in the early 1240s was, quite simply, catastrophic. The Mongol invasion under Batu Khan had swept through Russia between 1237 and 1240, devastating city after city. Vladimir, Ryazan, Kiev, once the great mother of Russian cities, the ancient heart of the Kievan Rus, all burned. The death toll was staggering. Entire populations were killed or enslaved. The political structures of the Russian principalities were shattered or made subordinate to the Mongol Golden Horde. Russian princes who survived did so, for the most part, by submitting to Mongol overlordship and paying tribute. Novgorod itself was spared direct Mongol assault. The spring thaw and the marshlands south of the city apparently deterred the Mongol cavalry, which depended on frozen ground to move at speed. But the principalities that formed Novgorod's natural hinterland and political allies to the south and east had been devastated. Novgorod was, in a sense, isolated, surrounded by catastrophe. And it was precisely into this power vacuum, this moment of Russian weakness, that the Teutonic and Livonian Knights saw an opportunity. The Knights had been probing eastward for some time. In 1240, the year before the Battle of the Ice, the Livonian Knights captured the Russian city of Pskov, a significant settlement close to Lake Peipus. They installed 2 of their own men as governors there. They were treating Pskov essentially as a conquered territory, a bridgehead into Russia, and Novgorod was next on the agenda. The logic of the Knights' expansion was, from their own perspective, entirely coherent. They were already operating in Estonia, just to the west. The Russian lands to the east represented an obvious continuation of the mission. More territory to Christianize, more peoples to convert, more resources to incorporate into the expanding Latin Christian world. The fact that the Russians were already Christians of a different kind was a problem, not a protection. And so the stage was set, the weakened Russian world reeling from the Mongol catastrophe, the aggressive, ideologically motivated Livonian knights pressing eastward, the great trading city of Novgorod caught between Mongol pressure from the east and Catholic pressure from the west. And in the middle of all of this, a young prince who had already been thrown out of the city once and who was about to be called back in desperate need. It is worth pausing here before we move to the next chapter to say something about the sources. The medieval sources for the Battle of the Ice are, like virtually all medieval sources, complicated and partial. The primary Russian account is a chronicle called The Life of Alexander Nevsky, written sometime in the late 13th century, decades after the events it describes, and written with the explicit purpose of celebrating Alexander as a saint and hero. It is not a neutral document. It is hagiography, literally the writing of saints, and it follows the conventions of that genre, which means Alexander is presented as very nearly perfect, and his enemies are presented as very nearly demonic. The Livonian sources, particularly the Livonian rhymed chronicle, written in the late 13th century in Middle High German, give a rather different account. They do not deny the defeat, but they minimize it. They say that 20 knights fell and 6 were captured. The Russian chronicle claims that the knights lost 400 dead and 50 captured, with figures that are almost certainly exaggerated in the other direction. The truth, as is so often the case in medieval military history, is somewhere in between and may not be fully recoverable. Archaeological evidence from the lake itself has been disappointingly sparse. Despite several serious attempts over the 20th century to find the remains of the battle on the lakebed, very little has been definitively identified. The lake's bottom is heavily silted. The precise location of the battle is still debated among historians, and the dramatic central element of the battle, the cracking of the ice, while almost certainly real in some sense, may have been rather less spectacular in reality than it became in legend. But that is rather the point of this story, isn't it? The Battle of the Ice is not just a military engagement. It is a story about how military engagements become myths, and what those myths do in the world long after the men who fought them are dead and gone. We will return to that theme at the very end of our time together tonight. But first, let us meet the man at the centre of it all. Chapter 2. Alexander Nevsky, the prince who was thrown out and called back. There is a particular kind of historical figure that appears in cultures all over the world, in every era, the leader who is cast out by the people he will eventually save. The prophet rejected in his own country. The general dismissed before the crisis that requires him. The prince exiled before the war that makes him legendary. Alexander of Novgorod, Alexander Nevsky, fits this archetype almost suspiciously well. Whether that is because the archetype is genuinely common, or because his later hagiographers shaped his story to fit it, is a question worth holding in mind as we go. Alexander was born around 1220, give or take a few years. The exact date is uncertain, as is so much else about his early life. His father was Yaroslav II, a prince of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality in central Russia, one of the major Russian states of the period. His mother was probably Rostislava of Smolensk. He was not, by birth, the Prince of Novgorod. He was a prince's son from a dynasty, the Rurikids, who had supplied rulers to various Russian cities for centuries, in a complicated system of rotational inheritance that made the dynastic politics of medieval Russia genuinely bewildering to anyone trying to follow it. Novgorod, as we discussed, had its own distinctive political culture. The city's assembly, the Vetch, had the power to invite princes to serve and the power to expel them. And so when Alexander arrived in Novgorod as a young man, probably in the 1230s, he was not a hereditary ruler in the Western European sense. He was, in a meaningful way, a contractor, hired help, if rather exalted hired help. The relationship between Alexander and Novgorod would be defined throughout his career by this fundamental tension. He needed Novgorod, its resources, its prestige, its position, and Novgorod needed him, his military skill, his connections, his ability to deal with the Mongols, who by the early 1240s had made themselves the effective overlords of most of Russia. But neither side trusted the other completely, and the assembly never entirely forgot that it had the power to dismiss him. Before we get to his exile and recall, we need to talk about what made Alexander remarkable enough to be recalled in the first place. And for that, we need to talk about the Battle of the Neva. The summer of 1240 was an exceptionally dangerous time for Novgorod. The Mongol storm had swept through central and southern Russia in the previous years. The city was isolated, its allies shattered, and it was precisely in this moment of vulnerability that the Swedes, who had their own interests in the region, their own crusading ambitions, and their own designs on the territory around the Gulf of Finland, chose to move. A Swedish force landed on the banks of the Neva River, the great river that flows out of Lake Ladoga into the Gulf of Finland, passing through what is now the city of St. Petersburg in the summer of 1240. The force was commanded, according to the Russian chronicles, by a Swedish nobleman named Birger Magnusson, though some historians have questioned whether Birger himself was actually present. The chronicles claim that Birger sent a message to Alexander, essentially announcing his arrival and his intentions in terms of considerable confidence, something to the effect of, "If you can, resist me." Alexander, who was 20 years old at the time, give or take, did not wait. He did not call a great assembly of all the forces available to him. He did not send to his father for reinforcements. He gathered what troops he could quickly, his personal retinue and some Novgorodian volunteers, and he marched immediately before the Swedes could consolidate their position or advance further inland. The battle that followed on July 15th, 1240, was swift and, by the standards of medieval warfare, decisive. Alexander's forces struck the Swedish camp in a surprise attack. The fighting was fierce but brief. The Swedes were driven back to their ships. They departed. Novgorod was safe, at least from that quarter. It was not, by any objective measure, a battle of world historical dimensions. The Swedish force was not enormous. The casualties were not staggering on either side. But in the context of the catastrophic summer of 1240, with Russian cities still smoking from the Mongol conquest, with the sense that all the walls were closing in, it was a genuine, tangible victory. And Alexander's speed of decision, his refusal to hesitate, his willingness to march before the window of opportunity closed, These were real military virtues, recognized as such by the people who experienced it. It was for this victory on the Neva that Alexander received the epithet by which history knows him, Nevsky, the Neva one, the man of the Neva. It is worth noting that this title was almost certainly not applied to him immediately after the battle. It seems to have been a later honorific, perhaps applied after his death. But it is the name that stuck, and we will use it. Now, here is where the story gets complicated in a very human way. Alexander returned to Novgorod after the Battle of the Neva as a hero, and then, apparently fairly quickly, the relationship between him and the Novgorodian assembly deteriorated. The chronicles are frustratingly vague about the specific reasons. There were likely several. Alexander was young and proud, by all accounts, a prince of an autocratic Russian tradition, suddenly embedded in the deeply oligarchic, committee-driven culture of Novgorodian governance. He may have overstepped. He may have made decisions without consulting the Vesh. He may have imposed taxes or demands that the merchant class found excessive. He may have simply been difficult to deal with. Whatever the specific reasons, sometime in 1240, the same year as the Battle of the Neva, though probably some months after it, Alexander was expelled from Novgorod by the assembly. He left. He went back to his family's territories in Pereyaslav-Zaleski, a city in central Russia. And Novgorod, having just won a significant victory against the Swedes, presumably felt that it could manage without him. It could not manage without him. The Livonian Knights moved fast. By the end of 1240, they had captured the city of Izborsk, a fortified town close to Pskov. Pskov itself fell shortly after, betrayed, according to the Russian chronicles, by a Pskovian nobleman named Tvrdila Ivankovich, who apparently opened the gates to the knights and collaborated with their subsequent rule. The knights installed 2 of their own men as administrators, the chronicles call them governors, and began treating Pskov as a conquered territory. And then they pressed further. Livonian raiding parties began operating within 30 kilometers of Novgorod itself, close enough to be seen, almost, from the city walls. They raided villages. They disrupted trade. They killed people. The message was clear. Novgorod was next. The Novgorodian assembly found itself in the position of a man who has fired his doctor and is now bleeding. They sent to Alexander. They asked him to come back. They swallowed whatever pride was necessary, and in a culture as intensely conscious of honor as medieval Russian aristocratic culture was, that took something, and they invited the prince they had expelled to return and save them. Alexander, for his part, did not immediately comply. He negotiated. He insisted on conditions, on more autonomy, on clearer authority over military decisions, on less interference from the assembly when it came to military command. He was not going to come back and be expelled again the moment the crisis passed, or at least he was going to try to prevent that. He came back on his own terms, or something closer to his own terms than before. He arrived in Novgorod in 1241. Within weeks, remarkable speed. Again, this was a consistent quality of Alexander's leadership. He had assembled forces and moved against the Livonian positions in the Novgorodian hinterland. He retook the fortification of Kopori, which the knights had captured and used as a forward base. He expelled or killed the Livonian garrison there. He reportedly executed a number of Estonian and Votian guides who had been assisting the Livonian advance, a harsh measure that tells us something about the ruthlessness that was part of the same package as his tactical brilliance. Great military commanders in the medieval world were almost never gentle, and Alexander was no exception. And then, in the early spring of 1242, he moved against Pskov itself. The recovery of Pskov was the operation that set the stage for the Battle of the Ice. Alexander and his forces, including troops sent by his brother Andrei from the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, crossed into Livonian-held territory after retaking Pskov. This was a significant escalation. He was not merely defending Novgorodian territory, he was raiding into what the knights considered their own operational area. He was sending a message. The message was received. The Livonian Knights, led by the master of the Livonian Order, we believe this was a man named Andreas von Felben, though the sources are not perfectly clear, assembled their forces and marched to meet Alexander. And Alexander, having provoked the response he wanted, began the maneuver that would define his legacy. He fell back, he retreated, he drew the knights after him, and he drew them toward Lake Peipus. Before we follow him onto the ice, though, let us linger a little longer with Alexander the man, as opposed to Alexander the military commander, because there is a dimension of his life that is often overlooked in popular accounts, but is essential to understanding who he was. Alexander Nevsky lived in the shadow of the Mongols. This is not a metaphor. This is a literal, practical, day-to-day reality of his political existence. After 1240, the Mongol Golden Horde was the supreme power in Russia. Russian princes held their positions at the pleasure of the Mongol Khan. They travelled to the Mongol court at Sarai on the Volga to receive patents, official documents confirming their right to rule their territories. They paid tribute. They sent soldiers when the Mongols demanded soldiers, and if they failed to cooperate, they and their families faced consequences that could be fatal. Alexander cooperated. More than cooperated, he cultivated the relationship. He made multiple trips to the Mongol court. He apparently developed something like a personal relationship with Batu Khan and later with Batu's son Sartak. He is said to have sworn brotherhood with Sartak, a significant ritual in Mongol culture. He worked within the Mongol system in ways that some of his contemporaries found troubling, even shameful. His brother Andrei, who had helped him at Pskov, later refused to cooperate with Mongol demands and was driven out of his principality by a Mongol punitive expedition in 1252. Alexander, by contrast, remained. He managed, he maneuvered, he occasionally used Mongol force as a threat against his own internal Russian rivals. He was, to put it plainly, a collaborator in the complex, morally ambiguous sense that term carries when applied to people navigating the realities of occupation. The Russian Orthodox Church later canonized him as a saint. Soviet historians celebrated him as a hero of Russian resistance, and yet his actual life was defined as much by accommodation with the Mongols as by resistance to the Knights. The contradiction is real, and it is not fully resolvable. Alexander was a man of his time, a prince trying to preserve what he could of Russian civilization and Novgorodian independence in genuinely catastrophic circumstances. He made choices that were pragmatic rather than heroic in the simple sense. And the fact that the later tradition remembered only the heroic dimension tells us a great deal about how history gets shaped. He died in 1263, returning from yet another visit to the Mongol court. He fell ill on the journey, possibly from exhaustion, or possibly from something he was exposed to during his time in the East. He was about 43 years old. He had been baptized Alexander, but took monastic vows as a monk named Alexis in his final days. He died in the city of Gorodets on the Volga River on November 14th, 1263. He was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1547, nearly 300 years after his death, by a Tsar named Ivan IV, who you may know as Ivan the Terrible, which tells you something, again, about the uses of Alexander's legend. But in the spring of 1242, Alexander was not yet 30 years old. He was a prince with a good track record and a clear-eyed understanding of the forces arrayed against him. And he was walking backward toward a frozen lake, trying to lure heavily armoured knights onto thin ice. Let us talk about those knights, and about the ice, and about why the equipment each side carried made all the difference in the world. Chapter 3. Asymmetric Warfare. Iron Men and Horse Archers on the Ice. There is a phrase in modern military thinking, asymmetric warfare, that describes conflicts between forces that are fundamentally unequal in their nature. One side might have more conventional military power, more troops, better equipment, superior organization. The other side compensates with unconventional tactics, mobility, knowledge of terrain, and an ability to turn the enemy's strengths against themselves. The Battle of the Ice is one of the earliest and most elegant examples of asymmetric warfare in recorded history. To understand why, we need to understand what each side was bringing to the fight. Let us start with the Teutonic and Livonian Knights, because they represent, in the context of the 13th century, something genuinely extraordinary in the history of human violence. They were, in a very real sense, the tanks of their era. The fully equipped heavy cavalry of the 13th century was the product of several hundred years of incremental improvement in metallurgy, horsemanship, and military tactics. By 1242, a Teutonic Knight in full equipment represented an enormous investment of resources, both in the materials required and in the years of training necessary to use that equipment effectively. Let us walk through what a Teutonic Knight wore, because the details matter enormously for the story of the battle. The foundation of his protection was mail, chainmail, constructed from thousands of interlocking iron rings. A mail hauberk, a long-sleeved coat of mail reaching to the knees or below, might contain upward of 15,000 to 30,000 individual rings, each one individually riveted closed. The weight of a full mail hauberk was typically in the range of 15 to 20 kilograms, roughly 33 to 44 pounds, though this varied depending on the density of the ring construction and whether the rings were riveted or simply butted. Beneath the mail, the knight wore a padded garment called a gambeson, essentially a thick quilted coat, which both cushioned the impact of blows and provided some independent protection. Over the mail, by the mid-13th century, many knights were beginning to add plates, solid pieces of iron or hardened leather, to cover the most vulnerable points. Plates for the shins, called greaves, plates for the knees, plates covering the hands, early gauntlets. The transition from purely mail-based armour to the plate armour that would define the late medieval knight was still in progress in 1242. so we should not imagine the fully encased knights in shining armour of popular imagination, but we should imagine something formidable, something heavy, something that, on a warm day, would have been genuinely dangerous to wear from the sheer heat it retained. The helmet of the period was typically a great helm, a cylindrical iron structure that enclosed the entire head, with narrow slits for vision and small holes for breathing. It was extraordinarily effective protection against the blows that knights most commonly faced. It was also, in hot conditions, effectively an oven for the head, and it significantly restricted peripheral vision, which would prove relevant on the ice. In addition to the personal armour, the knight's horse was increasingly protected as well. Horse armour, called barding, was beginning to be more widely used in this period, though its adoption was not universal. A destrier, the heavy warhorse ridden by a fully equipped knight, was itself an expensive and carefully trained animal. It had to be large enough to carry the combined weight of a knight in full armour, his saddle, and whatever barding was used. It had to be trained not to panic at the noise and chaos of battle, and it had to be trained to work with the rider in close combat, sometimes itself being used as a weapon. A destrier was not a draft horse and was not an ordinary riding horse. It was a specialized military instrument that required years of development and represented substantial wealth. Now add the weapons. The primary offensive weapon of the Teutonic Knight was the lance, a long wooden shaft, typically around 3 to 4 meters in length, with an iron or steel point. In a cavalry charge, the lance concentrated the momentum of horse and rider into a single point of impact. The force generated by a charging knight with a couched lance, tucked under the arm, stabilized against the body, was genuinely enormous. It could penetrate shields, it could dismount other riders. It could, under the right circumstances, simply batter through anything in its path. After the lance was used, or dropped, or shattered, the knight had a sword, a cruciform weapon of considerable quality, typically around 90 centimeters in length, and well balanced for both cut and thrust, and possibly a mace or war hammer as well. The shield of the 13th century knight was in transition as well. The older kite shield, long and pointed at the bottom, providing coverage from shoulder to knee for a mounted warrior, was gradually giving way to the smaller heater shield, which was more manoeuvrable and better suited to the style of fighting that was becoming standard. The shield was typically made of wood covered in leather and sometimes reinforced with iron bands or edging. It bore heraldic symbols, the visual language of medieval aristocratic identity that served both as identification on the battlefield and as assertion of lineage and status. The heraldic dimension of the knights, incidentally, was somewhat different from typical European noble practice. As members of a religious order, the Teutonic Knights wore the white mantle with the black cross that was their order's emblem. This was both distinctive, easily recognizable on the battlefield, and ideologically meaningful, white for purity, black for the cross of suffering. The visual identity was as much theological as military. Put all of this together and you have something that, in the military context of 13th century Europe, was nearly without equal. The Teutonic Knights were the apex predator of their environment. Against the pagan Prussians, against the Lithuanians, against the various Baltic peoples they had been conquering for decades, this combination of heavy armour, heavy horses, and drilled cavalry tactics was virtually unstoppable. But the Teutonic Knights were apex predators in a specific environment, and that environment was not a frozen lake in early April, with the ice softening in the spring thaw. Now let us look at what Alexander Nevsky brought to the fight. The Novgorodian military was a composite force drawing on several distinct traditions. At its core was the druzhina, the prince's personal retinue, his household warriors. These were professional soldiers, well equipped by the standards of Russian warfare, but equipped differently from the Western European knight. Russian warriors of the period favoured lamella armour, a style derived from steppe and Byzantine traditions, made of small iron or hardened leather plates laced together over chainmail, though chainmail was also used. The lamella construction tended to produce armour that was somewhat lighter and more flexible than equivalent chainmail protection, though perhaps marginally less effective against a direct thrust. Russian helmets were typically pointed or domed, rather than the cylindrical great helm of the Western knight. They often incorporated face guards, metal bars or plates protecting the face, but left more peripheral vision than the enclosed Western helm. Russian swords of the period were broadly similar to Western European swords, though with some stylistic differences. But the Russian warrior tradition also emphasized the spear, the battle axe, and a variety of other weapons in ways that perhaps reflected the different military challenges of the Russian environment, fighting from horseback on open steppe, defending fortified cities, and operating in forested terrain where the cavalry charge of Western Europe was not always practical. The Novgorodian militia, the townspeople and free men who made up the bulk of the fighting force beyond the professional druzhina, was equipped much more variably. Some would have had reasonable armour. Many would have had partial protection at best. They fought primarily on foot. They were not professional soldiers in the sense that the Teutonic Knights were. They were citizen warriors, with all the variability in training and equipment that implies. And then there were the horse archers. One of the most significant and least discussed aspects of Alexander Nevsky's military is the influence of steppe warfare traditions on his tactics. The Mongol invasion of Russia, catastrophic as it was, had exposed Russian warriors to a style of fighting that they did not forget. The Mongol style of war, built around extreme mobility, composite bow archery from horseback, feigned retreats designed to disorder pursuing enemies, and the ability to cover enormous distances with speed, was the most sophisticated military system in the world at that moment. And while Alexander could not replicate the full Mongol system, he could draw on elements of it. His forces in 1242 almost certainly included light cavalry familiar with steppe tactics, possibly Russian warriors who had served alongside or against the Mongols, possibly troops from the borderlands who had absorbed that tradition. The composite bow of the steppe, a short, recurved weapon of laminated wood, horn, and sinew that could be fired from horseback with considerable accuracy and a range significantly exceeding that of many Western European bows, was a key component of this tradition. The tactical implications of the equipment difference were profound, and Alexander was intelligent enough to understand them. A force of Teutonic Knights was nearly invulnerable to frontal attack by any force the Novgorodians could assemble. The knights' armour was too heavy, their training too good, their tactical discipline, built around the crushing momentum of the cavalry charge, too effective. In open field conditions, on firm ground, Alexander would lose. This was not a matter of courage or numbers. It was a matter of physics and metallurgy. You cannot defeat iron men on armoured horses with infantry and light cavalry in a straight fight. But a force of Teutonic Knights was also extremely specific in its vulnerabilities. The armour that made them nearly invulnerable on the charge made them nearly immobile when dismounted. A knight who fell from his horse in deep mud or snow and could not immediately remount was in serious difficulty. He could not easily stand up without assistance, and if his horse was killed or ran off, he might be effectively helpless. The armour that protected him from blades and arrows was also heavy enough to significantly restrict his speed of movement. The knight's horses, those expensive, specially trained destriers, were not well adapted to every terrain. On frozen lake ice, the traction conditions were challenging. Horseshoes of the period were not designed for ice. A heavy horse on ice is a horse in constant danger of slipping, and a heavy horse carrying an armoured rider on ice is even more precarious. The knight's formation, the famous tactical wedge, which we will discuss in detail in the next chapter, was devastatingly effective in the right circumstances. But it was a rigid formation. It committed the entire force to a single direction of attack. Once the wedge was set in motion, redirecting it was slow and difficult. It had limited adaptability to changing circumstances, and the terrain of Lake Peipus in early April was not the firm ground where the wedge performed best. It was ice that had been solid throughout the winter, but was now in the early stages of its spring thaw. The surface would have been wet in places. The ice would have varied in thickness, and the weight-bearing capacity of the ice was not uniform. In the shallows near the shore, the ice might have been adequately thick. Over deeper water, in the areas where underwater springs fed into the lake, the ice might have been dangerously thin. Alexander knew this lake. His forces had been operating in this region for weeks. He would have known, or had advisors who knew, the topography of the lake bed, where the deep water was, where the thin ice was, where the conditions were worst for heavy cavalry. And here is the strategic insight at the heart of the Battle of the Ice. Alexander understood that the Teutonic Knights' greatest strength, their armoured weight, their momentum, their crushing power on the charge, was precisely the thing that made them vulnerable on soft spring ice. The very thing that made them so terrifying in normal battle conditions was the thing that would, if the maneuver worked, pull them down through the ice and into the freezing water below. He needed to get them onto the ice. He needed them to commit their charge, and then he needed to let the physics do the work. This is the logic of the fighting retreat, of the feigned withdrawal that lured the knights forward. But a feigned retreat is one of the most difficult military maneuvers to execute in practice. To do it successfully, your troops have to run toward the enemy, make contact, fight briefly, and then turn and run away without actually breaking and routing. They have to run in a convincing enough way to persuade the enemy that they are genuinely fleeing, but in a controlled enough way that they do not actually flee, that they maintain unit cohesion, that they can stop running at the right moment and turn to fight again. This requires discipline that borders on superhuman in the chaos of actual battle. Mongol armies did it routinely. They had drilled it into their culture and their military training for generations. It was one of their signature tactical moves. Whether Alexander's forces had that level of expertise in the feigned retreat is uncertain, but the evidence, both from the Russian chronicles and from the mere fact that the battle played out the way it did, suggests that something like a controlled withdrawal did happen, and that it worked. The terrain, too, favoured the withdrawal. The forests and the shoreline of Lake Peipus would have provided cover for flanking forces, troops positioned to strike the knights' flanks and rear once they had committed to the pursuit. Alexander's plan, to the extent we can reconstruct it, seems to have involved using a central force to absorb the initial knights' charge, and then drawing them forward while flanking forces, possibly the light cavalry with bows, came around to hit them from the sides. The ice was not simply a passive element in this plan. The ice was the weapon, and Alexander chose to fight on it deliberately. We should also say something about the numbers involved in this battle, because the chronicles give us figures that are almost certainly wrong in specific ways, even if they gesture toward a real disproportion. The Russian chronicles, as noted earlier, claim 400 knights killed and 50 captured. The Livonian rhymed chronicle claims only 20 brothers killed and 6 captured. Modern historians generally believe the true numbers were somewhere in between, probably fewer than 3,000 combatants on each side, possibly significantly fewer, and fatalities perhaps in the hundreds rather than the thousands. But the relative composition matters more than the absolute numbers. The knights, with their heavy armour and specialised training, were expensive to produce and few in absolute terms. Their corps of fully armoured brothers was small, perhaps a few hundred at most. They supplemented this corps with allied and auxiliary troops, Estonians, local Baltic peoples, possibly some Danes, possibly some Baltic German settlers. These auxiliaries were less heavily equipped and less well trained. Alexander's forces were numerically larger, probably somewhat larger, but less individually powerful. His dragina were good professional soldiers. His militia were variable. His light cavalry were mobile and effective in the right terrain. The battle was not, on paper, a mismatch in the direction that the later legend implies. The Livonian order in 1242 was not at the height of its power. It had suffered that catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Lithuanians in 1236 at the Battle of Saul, where the Grand Master of the Swords, the order Alexander's enemies had been absorbed from, was killed. It had not fully recovered. Its forces in the field at the Battle of the Ice were formidable but not overwhelming. What was overwhelming, in a very specific and ultimately decisive way, was the physical environment that Alexander had chosen for the confrontation. And that environment is what we turn to now, as we walk through the battle itself. Chapter 4. The Pig Formation. How the Ice Broke. April 5th, 1242. The sun rises over the landscape of the Russian northwest, forests of birch and pine, frozen rivers, and ahead of the Livonian column, the vast expanse of Lake Peipus. Peipus, in Russian, Chudskoye Ozero, the Chud Lake, is one of the largest lakes in Europe. At its widest, it spans nearly 50 kilometers. At its northern end, where it connects to the smaller Lake Pskov through a narrow strait called the Teplo Ozero, the Warm Lake, a name whose significance we will return to, the ice in early April was still present, but beginning its seasonal transition. Let us pause here and think for a moment about what the lake itself was like on that particular morning, because the physical setting is not simply backdrop, it is the protagonist of the final act. Lake Peipus sits on the border between the Russian and Estonian worlds, and it has been a frontier zone for as long as people have lived in the region. It is a shallow lake in most of its extent. The average depth is something around 7.5 meters, though there are deeper areas, and its shallow nature means that it freezes reliably in winter and thaws relatively quickly in spring. In early April, the ice would have been in a state that any experienced local would have recognized as dangerous, still present across the surface, still thick enough in some areas to support considerable weight, but compromised. The freeze and thaw cycle of late winter and early spring creates conditions in which the ice is not uniformly trustworthy. Areas that were solid 3 weeks earlier might now have weakened from below, where the warming water was beginning to eat at the underside of the ice sheet, and from above, where the increasing hours of sunlight were softening the surface. The people who lived around Lake Peipus understood this intimately. Fishermen who worked the lake in winter knew exactly which areas froze to the bottom early and stayed solid late, and which areas were treacherous in the spring transition. They would have known where the underwater springs were, those channels of relatively warm groundwater that prevented the ice from forming to full thickness directly above them. They would have known that the Teplo-Ozero Strait was chronically the weakest ice on the whole system, because the flow of water between the two lakes prevented full freezing even in the coldest winters. Alexander's forces had been in this region for weeks. He would have gathered this local knowledge, and on the morning of April 5th he used it. The Livonian force had been pursuing Alexander's retreating army. For days, perhaps, the Russians had been falling back, not in route, but in that disciplined, difficult withdrawal that Alexander had orchestrated. Scouts and raiding parties had clashed. Small engagements had been fought. The knights were pursuing because they believed they were winning, because the Russians appeared to be running away. Now, on the morning of April 5th, Alexander stopped running. He chose his ground. He arrayed his forces on or near the ice of Lake Peipus, with particular attention, we believe, to placing his strongest, most reliable troops on the wings, and his least heavily armoured forces in the centre. This is, in fact, a detail that several historians have noted as indicating real tactical sophistication. Normally, a commander places his best troops at the centre of his line, because the centre is where the main force of a cavalry charge will strike. Alexander appears to have done the opposite. His centre was, deliberately, relatively weak. His wings were strong. This is a classic setup for a double envelopment, the encirclement manoeuvre that was the tactical goal of so many great commanders in history, from Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae to various commanders in much later eras. You let the enemy break through the centre, and then the wings come around to close the trap behind them. The Teutonic and Livonian forces, seeing the Russian line, prepared their response. And their response was what they always did when confronted with an enemy in open battle. They formed the keel, the wedge. The formation that the Russian chronicles call the svinya, the pig, or the boar's snout, because of its pointed, forward driving shape. The keel was the signature formation of the Teutonic Knights, and it is worth describing in some detail, because understanding it is essential to understanding how the battle developed and why it ended the way it did. Imagine a triangle. At the point, the very front, rode the most experienced knights. Perhaps a single knight, or 2 or 3 riding side by side, forming the tip. Behind them, the formation widened, 3 or 4 knights across, then 5, then 7, then more. The further back in the formation, the wider the line, though the shape remained triangular. The point of the triangle was directed at the enemy. The purpose of this formation was to concentrate enormous striking force at a single point. When the keel moved forward at the canter and then the gallop, it functioned like a spearhead, driving through the enemy line, splitting it apart, creating a breach through which the following troops could pour. The knights at the point bore the brunt of the initial impact and were presumably the most experienced and best armoured. The men further back were there to follow through, to widen the breach, to exploit the chaos created by the initial impact. The keel was extraordinarily effective against formations that did not know how to respond to it, against troops who had never faced it before, or who lacked the discipline to hold their ground against the thundering approach of dozens of armoured horses. It was essentially unstoppable. The psychological impact alone, the sight and sound of that much armoured weight-building speed and coming directly at you, was enough to break many forces before the physical impact even occurred. But it had weaknesses that a sufficiently skilled and forewarned commander could exploit. First, it was a directional formation. It went forward, and turning it significantly was slow. Second, once committed to the charge, the formation had limited ability to respond to threats from the flanks or the rear. Third, and most relevantly here, the formation required firm ground. It needed a surface on which heavy horses could build and maintain speed, on which the hooves could find grip, on which the collective weight of the formation could be supported without catastrophic failure of the terrain beneath. The ice of Lake Peipus in April provided none of these things reliably. Now let us walk through the battle itself, as best the sources and reasonable inference allow us to reconstruct it. The Livonian force seize the Russian line. They form the keel. They advance. The horses build speed. The tip of the formation, the most heavily armed and armoured knights, the bravest or most reckless at the point of the wedge, drives toward the Russian centre. The Russian centre, deliberately weakened, remember, cannot hold. The chronicles are reasonably consistent on this point. The centre breaks. The knights drive through it. They push forward, further onto the ice, following the fleeing Russian infantry. More knights pile in behind, widening the breach, pushing deeper. And here, the topography begins to matter. If Alexander had chosen his position wisely, and all indications are that he had, the area into which the knights were now driving, the centre of the lake, was precisely the area where the ice was thinnest. The area near the shore, where the water was shallow and the ice had frozen to the bottom or close to it, was relatively firm. But the deeper centre of the lake, where the water below was dark and cold, and the ice was supported only by its own structural integrity, that was where the April thaw had done its most dangerous work. The chronicles describe the ice beginning to crack. The Russian accounts are dramatic here. They speak of a terrible groaning sound as the ice yielded under the weight of the knights, of men and horses suddenly plunging through, of the black water of the lake swallowing iron-armoured figures who could not swim and could not easily shed their equipment. Now, what exactly happened is a question where the sources are less reliable than we would like them to be. Did the ice simply crack under the accumulated weight of hundreds of armoured figures pressing onto an area of thin ice? That is possible, and perhaps probable. The weight of a Livonian knight in full armour on a fully armoured horse could easily exceed 600 kilograms, roughly 1,300 pounds, concentrated on whatever area of ice was beneath those hooves. Multiple such figures in close formation would have placed extraordinary stress on a section of ice that was already weakening in the April thaw. But there is another possibility, not mutually exclusive with the first, that is suggested by the name of the strait between the two lakes, Teplo-Ozero, the warm lake. This strait is warm because underwater springs feed into it, and those springs prevent the ice from forming or maintaining the same thickness as elsewhere on the lake. If part of the Russian plan involved positioning the Knights' breakthrough point specifically over this area of chronically weaker ice, if Alexander knew about the springs, knew about the thin ice, and designed the fight to push the Knights precisely there, then what happened was not an accident of weight and temperature, but a deliberate exploitation of terrain knowledge. This interpretation, Alexander as a man who understood his terrain intimately and weaponized it, is consistent with everything else we know about his military thinking. He had been operating in this region for months. He had the kind of local knowledge that an invading army from Livonia would not have, using that knowledge to turn the enemy's greatest strength, their heavy armour, into a fatal liability is exactly the kind of asymmetric thinking we have been describing. While the central breakthrough was becoming a catastrophe in the thin ice, the Russian wings, which had not broken, were moving. The light cavalry on the flanks had waited for the moment of the Knights' maximum commitment, maximum forward momentum, maximum exposure. Now they came in. From the north and south, the Novgorodian and allied forces closed around the struggling mass of knights and auxiliaries in the centre. The encirclement that Alexander had designed was snapping shut. The auxiliaries who had been following behind the Kiel, the Estonian and Baltic allies, the less heavily armoured troops, broke under this pressure. The chronicles say they ran. The Russian cavalry pursued them across the ice and into the forest beyond the shore, cutting them down for a considerable distance. The knights themselves, those who had not gone through the ice, fought on in the conditions that were now terrible for them. Their horses were struggling on the wet, cracking surface. Their formation had dissolved into individual or small group combats. Their great helms restricted their vision to a narrow forward arc, making them vulnerable to attacks from unexpected directions. Those who fell on the ice could not quickly get up again. Those whose horses had slipped or fallen were in desperate difficulty. The pursuit continued even after the main engagement ended. The Russian chronicles claim that Alexander's forces chased the surviving enemies for 7 kilometers, a distance called roughly to the Subol shore, wherever precisely that was, cutting down those who tried to flee and taking prisoners. When it was over, the lake was strewn with the evidence of the defeat: broken ice, equipment, horses, the bodies of men in the cold water beneath, their iron armour pulling them down into the darkness of the April lake. The survivors of the Livonian force retreated westward back into Livonia, having learned a lesson about the limits of their tactical model in unfamiliar terrain. Now, we should be careful here about a romantic detail that has attached itself to the battle in the popular imagination. The image of hundreds of knights drowning as the ice catastrophically collapsed beneath them in a single dramatic moment, like a frozen lake suddenly becoming an abyss. The visual is extraordinary. Sergei Eisenstein made extraordinary cinematic use of it in his 1938 film, and we will talk about that film at length in the next chapter. But the historical reality was almost certainly less spectacular than the cinematic version. Modern research suggests that the collapse of the ice, if it occurred in the dramatic wholesale sense, was probably more localized than the legend implies. The primary killing was likely done by conventional combat, by sword and spear and axe, with the ice conditions serving to prevent the knights from forming up effectively and to deny them the mobility their style of warfare depended upon. Some men certainly did go through the ice, but the image of vast numbers of armoured figures simultaneously plunging into a suddenly opened abyss is almost certainly an elaboration of what was probably a more chaotic and piecemeal process. The outcome, however, was real and was significant. The Livonian order lost enough men and prestige that it was in no position to threaten Novgorod or Pskov in the immediate aftermath. A peace treaty was concluded later in 1242, in which the knights renounced all claims to Russian territory and released their Russian prisoners. It was a genuine diplomatic victory for Novgorod and for Alexander, accompanying the military one. But the battle itself, in absolute terms, was not one of the great slaughters of medieval history. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214, the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the Battle of Crécy in 1346, these were battles involving tens of thousands of combatants and thousands of casualties. The Battle of the Ice involved hundreds on each side, possibly a few thousand at most, and casualties probably in the low hundreds. In the cold arithmetic of medieval military history, it was a skirmish of moderate scale. So why does it matter? Why is it remembered? Why has it been turned into legend, into film, into a symbol of Russian national identity? The answer to those questions lies not in the battle itself, but in what happened to the battle afterward, in the extraordinary, somewhat cynical, and deeply revealing story of how a medieval fight on a frozen lake was resurrected 700 years later to serve the needs of a very different world. Chapter 5: Eisenstein and Stalin, the politics of a frozen memory. We are now in 1938. Europe is approximately 1 year away from the beginning of the Second World War. Adolf Hitler has already absorbed Austria into the German Reich in the Anschluss. The Sudetenland crisis is building. The Spanish Civil War is bleeding into its final year. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin is in the midst of the Great Terror, the systematic purging of real, imagined, and simply inconvenient enemies from the Soviet Communist Party, the Red Army, and Soviet society at large. Show trials, confessions extracted under torture, millions sent to the Gulag, hundreds of thousands executed. It is in this context, this atmosphere of paranoia, nationalism, and imminent external threat, that one of the most celebrated films in the history of cinema was produced. And it was produced explicitly and without any attempt to hide the fact as propaganda. Alexander Nevsky, directed by Sergei Mikhailovich Eisenstein, released in 1938, is a film about the Battle of the Ice. It stars Nikolai Cherkasov as Alexander Nevsky. It features a score by the composer, Sergei Prokofiev, one of the greatest collaborations between a director and a composer in cinema history, which produced music of such power that the film's battle sequence on the ice remains genuinely affecting even to a modern viewer who knows nothing about the historical events depicted. The film was commissioned by Stalin himself, or at least with Stalin's explicit approval and close involvement, and it was designed to do a very specific job. Let us back up a little and understand who Eisenstein was and what his relationship with Stalin was, because that relationship is as strange and revealing as the film itself. Sergei Eisenstein was born in 1898 in Riga, then part of the Russian Empire, now the capital of Latvia, to an architect father and a mother from a wealthy merchant family. He was not, by background, a natural Bolshevik, but he came of age in the revolution, embraced Soviet cinema as an art form and a political tool, and made his reputation with a series of films in the 1920s that are still studied in film schools around the world. Battleship Potemkin from 1925 depicted the 1905 mutiny on the battleship Potemkin and the subsequent Odessa massacre in a way that was simultaneously moving, technically revolutionary, and entirely fictional in its details. October from 1928 depicted the Bolshevik Revolution. Strike from 1925 depicted labor organizing. These films established the techniques of montage, the rapid cutting of short shots that Eisenstein used as his signature aesthetic, and they established him as the most celebrated Soviet filmmaker of his generation. But Eisenstein's relationship with Soviet power was never entirely comfortable. His ambitions were enormous, and not always aligned with what the party wanted. His 1930 project in Mexico, Que Viva Mexico, a sprawling, unfinished epic about Mexican culture and history, was shut down, its footage taken from him, the project abandoned. His 1937 film Bezhin Meadow, about a young boy who denounced his own father to Soviet authorities, was banned as artistically insufficient and politically unsound. By 1937, Eisenstein was in a genuinely dangerous position. He had failed to deliver work that satisfied Stalin. He was associated with a project that the state had condemned. And this was the Great Terror, a period when far less visible people than Sergei Eisenstein were disappearing. Into this desperate situation came the commission for Alexander Nevsky. It was, in every sense, a lifeline. If he could produce a film that Stalin approved, that the public loved, that served the political needs of the moment, he might survive. And he delivered. The film is extraordinary. Let us describe it, because many of you have likely never seen it, and even if you have, revisiting it through the lens of its historical context reveals things that a simple viewing might not. The film opens in the aftermath of the Mongol invasion, an important framing choice, as we will see. We see the devastated Russian landscape, the ruined cities, Alexander Nevsky living among simple fishermen, respected but not yet risen to his calling. Two groups of visitors arrive, Mongol officials demanding tribute and representatives from Novgorod and Pskov begging for his help against the Teutonic Knights. The film immediately establishes a hierarchy of threats. The Mongols can be dealt with through diplomatic accommodation. The Teutonic Knights are the existential enemy. This was, of course, a remarkable inversion of Alexander's actual historical priorities. As we have discussed, the real Alexander Nevsky spent an enormous amount of his career managing, appeasing, and cooperating with the Mongols, who were, by any measure, the greater force pressing on Russia. The Teutonic Knights were a real threat to Novgorod, but not to Russia as a whole. The film systematically downplays the Mongol dimension, cannot have the heroic Russian fighting the Eastern invader, because in 1938 the Soviet Union was trying not to antagonize Japan and elevates the Western threat, because in 1938 Nazi Germany was the enemy Stalin needed his people to think about. The Teutonic Knights in the film are portrayed with a deliberate, almost cartoonish evil. Their helmets are surmounted with strange, horned and animal-shaped decorations that are historically absurd but visually striking. They march with mechanical, inhuman precision. A monk accompanying them throws Russian children into a fire. They speak in harsh, guttural German phrases. They are, in every visual and dramatic sense, monsters. And they are monsters wearing armour that, to any audience in 1938, was unmistakably reminiscent of the iconography of the German Wehrmacht, the eagle emblems, the Iron Cross, the imagery of Teutonic Germanic martial culture. This was not accidental. Eisenstein and his collaborators drew on the visual and iconographic language of medieval Germany and mapped it onto the contemporary German threat in a way that required no explanation. You did not have to be told that the Teutonic Knights represented Nazi Germany. The images told you. Alexander himself, in the film, is a kind of Soviet ideal hero, physically magnificent, morally uncomplicated, beloved by the common people, a natural leader who has temporarily stepped away from power but returns at the moment of his people's need. He is a prince, but also somehow a man of the people. He is strong, but also wise. He laughs. He is approachable. He is, in short, nothing at all like the historically complicated, diplomatically nimble, Mongol-accommodating real Alexander. He is the Alexander that Soviet Russia in 1938 needed to believe in. The climactic battle sequence on the ice is the masterpiece of the film, and it remains genuinely extraordinary cinema. Eisenstein and his team shot it in summer on the backlot of Mosfilm Studios in Moscow, using sawdust, sand, and bleached salt to simulate ice and snow, Lake Peipus in April being, naturally, not cooperative for a summer film shoot. The ice-breaking sequence was achieved through various practical effects, and Prokofiev's score for the sequence, the Battle on the Ice cantata, builds from ominous low strings through percussion and brass to a climax of orchestral fury that is almost physically overwhelming. The image of thousands of armoured knights plunging through suddenly breaking ice, of the darkness of the lake swallowing the German invaders while the victorious Russians watch from the shore, is cinema of the highest order. It is also almost entirely a myth. The film was released in November of 1938. It was an enormous popular success. Stalin reportedly loved it. He personally awarded Eisenstein the Order of Lenin, the Soviet Union's highest civilian honor. The film was shown widely across the Soviet Union, was praised in the press, and became one of the most celebrated Soviet films ever made. It is worth dwelling a little longer on Prokofiev's score, because the collaboration between Eisenstein and Prokofiev on this film is one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of cinema, and it is crucial to the film's power. Sergei Prokofiev was, by 1938, one of the greatest living composers in the world, a man whose earlier career had taken him to Paris and the United States, who had worked with Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, who had composed works of extraordinary invention and sophistication. He had returned to the Soviet Union in 1936, a decision that many of his Western colleagues found baffling given the political atmosphere, and was navigating the same complicated landscape of official approval and artistic integrity that defined the cultural life of every significant Soviet artist. Prokofiev and Eisenstein worked on the Battle on the Ice sequence with unprecedented integration. Eisenstein would screen footage for Prokofiev, Prokofiev would compose music, and then Eisenstein would sometimes re-edit the footage to fit the music rather than the other way around. The result was a synchronization of image and sound that was at the time genuinely unprecedented. The music swells as the knights advance across the ice. The percussion thunders with the hooves, and in the aftermath, in the long lyrical sequence after the battle, the music becomes a lament, tender and expansive, as the Russian women move among the fallen, searching for their dead. It is, whatever its propagandistic purposes, genuinely moving art. The score was later arranged by Prokofiev into a cantata for orchestra, chorus, and mezzo-soprano, a concert work that stands entirely on its own merits and is still performed regularly in concert halls around the world. The seventh movement, The Battle on the Ice, remains one of the most viscerally exciting pieces of orchestral music in the standard repertoire. If you have never heard it, it is worth seeking out. Just be aware, as you listen, of what it was made to do. And then Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In August of 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany entered into a non-aggression agreement, a diplomatic bombshell that shocked the world, and that made Alexander Nevsky, with its obvious anti-German message, suddenly an embarrassing film to have in circulation. The film was immediately withdrawn from Soviet screens. It was quietly shelved. Eisenstein, who had just achieved his greatest triumph, found himself once again in a complicated position. And then, on June 22nd, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. And Alexander Nevsky was immediately brought back out of the vault and put back into cinemas, because now the 13th century battle against the Teutonic Knights was needed again, more urgently than ever. The timing was not lost on anyone. A film about a Russian prince who defeated German invaders on ice, released again in the first weeks of the most catastrophic war Russia had ever faced, carried a message that required no commentary. Russia had faced German invaders before. Russia had won. Russia would win again. The film accompanied the entire course of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet term for the conflict with Germany, which deliberately invoked the earlier patriotic wars against Napoleon. Alexander Nevsky was shown to troops at the front. It was shown to factory workers in the interior. It was shown everywhere, the message of Russian resilience and the ultimate defeat of the Germanic invader needed reinforcing. And the message worked, in the sense that propaganda can work, not by persuading people to believe things that are entirely false, but by giving existing feelings and loyalties and fears a shape, a narrative, a set of images to attach themselves to. Russian people fighting Nazi Germany did not need to be told that their enemy was threatening and powerful. They knew that in their bones, in the most visceral and terrible way. What they needed, what the film provided, was the image of victory, the image of the ice breaking, the image of the Germanic knights sinking, the image of Alexander Nevsky standing on the shore, triumphant. It is worth saying something about Alexander Nevsky's status in the Russian and then Soviet national imagination beyond just the 1938 film. He had been canonized as a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1547. During the Soviet period, the church was suppressed, and religious canonization was an awkward concept for a state officially committed to atheism. And yet Stalin, who had studied to be a priest before becoming a revolutionary, a biographical detail that is itself one of the stranger facts in a century full of strange facts, had a complex and often instrumental relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. During the war, he made significant concessions to the Church because its moral authority was needed for the war effort. And so, Alexander Nevsky was simultaneously a medieval military hero, a Russian Orthodox saint, and a Soviet patriotic symbol. He occupied all three of these categories simultaneously, which says something remarkable about the elasticity of historical legend. The same figure, the same story, a prince who defeated German knights on a frozen lake, could be shaped to serve the needs of a medieval religious institution, a 17th century autocratic czar, a 20th century totalitarian state, and a world at war. The specific circumstances of 1242 were, in a sense, almost beside the point. What mattered was the emotional truth that the story conveyed. Russia had been threatened by a Western invader. Russia had found a leader. Russia had won. The Eisenstein film had one more act to play. After the war, as the Soviet Union settled into the Cold War posture, the film remained in circulation. Eisenstein himself died in 1948, on his 50th birthday, of a heart attack, in the middle of a party celebrating his recovery from an earlier heart attack, which is one of the more darkly comic endings in the history of cinema. He never completed another film after Alexander Nevsky at the level he hoped. His Ivan the Terrible project, while containing some extraordinary material, was partly banned by Stalin and left unfinished at his death. Alexander Nevsky remained his most complete, most celebrated, most seen work. The film he made to save his life became the film that defined his legacy. The battle itself continued to be invoked throughout the Soviet period, whenever the language of Russian national resilience against Western aggression was needed. It appeared in children's textbooks. It appeared in public art. The image of Alexander standing on the ice, sword raised, became one of the most reproduced images in Soviet patriotic iconography. There were statues, murals, postage stamps, commemorative medals. The 700th anniversary in 1942 was observed with official ceremonies even as the actual war with Germany was raging, a deliberate act of historical resonance, the medieval victory being invoked at the moment of the modern crisis. And after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the uses of Alexander Nevsky did not stop. In the new Russia, navigating its post-Soviet identity, Alexander remained a potent symbol, now slightly recalibrated, his Orthodox Christianity foregrounded rather than downplayed, his role as a protector of the Russian people against Western encroachment, given new readings in a new geopolitical context. In 2008, a Russian television poll conducted by the channel Russia, a poll called The Name of Russia, asked viewers to vote for the greatest Russian of all time. The winner was Alexander Nevsky, who defeated such competitors as Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Joseph Stalin himself. In a country with more than 1,000 years of remarkable history, the medieval prince who fought on the ice was chosen as the greatest Russian who ever lived. That tells you something about Russia, certainly, but also about the enduring power of the particular story Alexander Nevsky represents, the story of the leader who returns in the moment of crisis, who uses intelligence rather than brute force, who knows the terrain and uses it, who wins against the odds and preserves what matters. It is a story that cultures return to in different forms again and again, because it is a story about the possibility of survival. In 1942, the 700th anniversary of the battle, Stalin established the Order of Alexander Nevsky as a military decoration to be awarded to Soviet officers who had shown particular skill in defensive operations. The decoration featured a portrait of Nikolai Cherkasov, the actor who had played Alexander Nevsky in Eisenstein's film, rather than any historically accurate image of the actual prince. The man who had played a fictional version of a medieval hero became the face of a modern military honour. The layers of representation had become so dense that the original was no longer visible. This tells us something important about how history works in practice. We think of history as the study of the past, but history is also, and perhaps equally, the study of how the past has been imagined, represented, and used by subsequent generations who needed it to mean something specific to them. The Battle of the Ice, whatever exactly happened on April 5th, 1242, immediately began to be narrated and shaped. The life of Alexander Nevsky, written in the late 13th century, shaped it for an audience that needed a saint. The Russian chronicles of later centuries elaborated on it for audiences that needed national heroes. Eisenstein's film shaped it for an audience that needed to believe that Germans could be defeated. Soviet wartime propaganda used it for an audience that needed the courage to keep fighting. And in each of these shapings, something of the real event, however limited our access to the real event actually is, was simplified, dramatized, exaggerated. The ice broke more dramatically in Eisenstein than it probably did in 1242. The knights were more monstrous. Alexander was more saintly. The victory was more complete and more cosmic in its significance. Is this dishonest? Well, it is not straightforwardly honest, but it is profoundly human. This is what cultures do with their significant events. They tell stories about them. They shape those stories to serve present needs. They pass those shaped stories on to the next generation, who shapes them further for their own needs. By the time the story reaches us, it has been through so many hands, so many retellings, so many productions, from the medieval chronicle to the Soviet film to the modern historical account, that we are, in a sense, not reading about the Battle of the Ice at all. We are reading about all the different ways that the Battle of the Ice has been remembered. And yet, and this seems important to say, something real did happen. On April 5th, 1242, on the ice of a lake in what is now the border region between Russia and Estonia, two armies met. One of them had heavier armour and a more rigid tactical doctrine. One of them had better knowledge of the terrain and a commander who was willing to use asymmetric tactics rather than meet the enemy on their own terms. The lighter, more mobile force won. Some men went through the ice. The heavier force retreated and eventually made peace. These things happened. The details are uncertain, the numbers are uncertain, the exact location is uncertain, but something fundamentally like this happened. And it mattered, enough to be recorded, enough to be remembered, enough to become the seed around which so many subsequent narratives grew. Alexander Nevsky, the man, complicated, pragmatic, politically skilled, Mongol accommodating, and genuinely capable of inspired tactical thinking, lived and made choices and died on his way back from paying tribute to the Khan. He was many things that the legend he eventually spawned was not. He was not simple. He was not morally uncomplicated. He did not resist only the enemies that later tradition found it convenient to remember. He worked with some enemies to defeat others. He made hard choices in catastrophic circumstances and preserved what he could. That, actually, might be more impressive than the legend, more impressive and more instructive and more human. The legend gives us a hero. The history gives us a man trying to navigate an impossible situation with limited resources and considerable intelligence, and largely succeeding. The history might be the more useful story, even if it is less stirring. But the legend is why we are here tonight, telling this story. The legend is why the Battle of the Ice is remembered, and not the dozens of other medieval skirmishes of comparable size that happened across Europe in the same decade and left no trace in the popular imagination. The legend is why a fight on a frozen lake in 1242 can still make a film composer write music that sounds like the end of the world, and why that music can still make people feel something when they hear it. 700 years later, history is not just what happened. History is what we remember and what we remember it for. And perhaps there is something appropriate, even something honest in that. We are storytelling creatures. We make sense of ourselves and our world through narrative. The events of the past are, in a meaningful sense, raw material, not fixed objects that can be carried unchanged across centuries, but seeds that grow differently in different soils, shaped by the light and rain of the eras that receive them. Alexander Nevsky in the 13th century was a prince trying to survive. Alexander Nevsky in the 15th century was a national saint for a consolidating Russian state. Alexander Nevsky in 1938 was a cinematic hero for a country bracing for catastrophic war. And Alexander Nevsky in the present day is all of these things simultaneously: a historical figure, a mythological figure, a propaganda tool, and, underneath all of it, the dim but real outline of an actual man who stood on the ice of a particular lake on a particular morning and watched the formation of heavily armoured knights come toward him and did not flinch. What we do with the stories that come down to us from history is always, in part, a choice. We can choose to flatten them, to receive them as the legend gives them, heroes and villains, divine interventions and national destinies. Or we can choose to look at them more carefully, which means accepting more complexity, more ambiguity, more of the uncomfortable truth that the people who made history were people, limited, contradictory, pragmatic, sometimes noble, sometimes not, navigating circumstances they did not fully understand with tools that were never quite adequate to the task. The Battle of the Ice was a real battle, fought by real people, under conditions of real uncertainty and real fear. The ice really cracked, at least somewhat. Men really fell through it. A prince really made smart decisions about terrain and timing, and the exploitation of his enemy's rigidity. And something real was preserved: a city's independence, a religious community's continuity, a people's ability to tell their own stories for another generation. That is not a small thing. Even stripped of the legend, even reduced to its historical minimum, the Battle of the Ice was a moment when a smaller and less equipped force, led by a man of genuine intelligence and nerve, defeated a more powerful enemy through asymmetric thinking and intimate knowledge of the ground beneath their feet. That deserves to be remembered, even if the ice cracked a little less dramatically than the films suggest. Even if Alexander was a little more complicated than the icon paintings show. even if the meaning of the battle has been reinvented more times than we can count. The ice cracked, the knights fell, Novgorod survived, and 780 years later, on a quiet night with a podcast playing gently in the background, you heard about it. That seems like enough. And with that, we find ourselves at the end of tonight's episode of Sleepless History. We have travelled from the theological quarrels that divided Rome and Constantinople a millennium ago, through the forests and frozen rivers of medieval Livonia, across the groaning ice of Lake Peipus, and into the projection rooms of 1930s Moscow, where a filmmaker and a dictator were trying to reach across 7 centuries and use a dead prince to save their country. The Battle of the Ice is, in its way, a perfect story for this channel, because it is a story about the slow accumulation of events, each one building on the last, each one carrying the weight of what came before, until a morning in April on a frozen lake when all of that weight came together and the ice broke. That is history. That is how it works. Not in sudden, clean moments of pure drama, but in the slow, complicated, often contradictory accumulation of choices and circumstances and accidents and contingencies that occasionally, at specific moments, crystallize into something that people will be talking about 780 years later. If you are still awake, welcome to a slightly expanded understanding of one of the more remarkable events of the medieval world. If you drifted off somewhere over the Teutonic Knights' armour specifications, that is entirely acceptable, and we hope the journey was a pleasant one. We will be back next time with another episode of Sleepless History. Until then, rest well.